Hi everyone, welcome to our second webinar from our series 2 of Leadership Lens season, all about the illusion of alignment. While we are just waiting for a few more people to join, I thought I'd just pose a question to everyone, just get you thinking a little bit about your team at the moment, because we are talking about alignment. I'm just wondering if you're thinking about these 5 different reasons below, which is the biggest challenge that your team is facing at the moment. And by no means is this an exhaustive list, but when I work with leadership teams, I often come across some version of these themes when we're looking at dynamics and effectiveness. So if any of them are resonating with you, please do put your responses in the chat function. But also, if there's any other challenges that you're facing that you might be impacting effectiveness of your team, it would be great to hear. It might resonate with other people in the room. But we'll just give it another minute while we wait. It'd be good to just see what others are potentially facing, because we will come back to these and we'll link into them as we're going through the session today as well. Yes, different perspective, conflicting priorities. Yeah, that pops up quite a lot. All about how people are understanding and receiving the messages that are being communicated. Thank you. Well, I'll all of them are biggest challenges. Yeah, I think if there is quite a bit of misalignment in the team, then you can see all of these coming through. When there's smaller alignment, it might be 1 or 2, but then they start to build. And conflicting priorities and pulling in different directions is often that a clear indication of misalignment. But feel free to keep adding into the chat. But what I'll do, because I am conscious of time, I will get started. But the chat function is always there for you. Please do put your questions, comments, and thoughts in there as well. But again, thank you for joining us for our second webinar, The Illusion of Alignment. And I wanted to talk about this today because I do a lot of work with leadership teams and have done for quite a few years now. And what I often find that is, on the surface, many of them look highly effective, relationships are good, meetings run well, doesn't really appear to be any obvious conflict or tension. But then I'm brought in, and sometimes that's because things seem a little bit off. There's a little bit of a niggle and people aren't quite sure what they are. Other times teams are looking at how to enhance their effectiveness, sustain high performance, particularly as pressure increases and complexity increases. And I think when we working with teams and we're kind of just digging that little bit deeper, we often discover some very subtle gaps. They can be in priorities, which we've got in the webinar chat coming through, assumptions, expectations, and just understanding of these different things. And in a lot of ways, it's not anything that's overly dramatic, but when you have really small differences, it can have quite a surprisingly large impact on how the team's performing. So today, what we're going to do is explore what causes those the misalignment in teams, how to spot it, and we'll look at some practical ways that you can strengthen alignment within your teams as well. So thank you to everyone that's put your thoughts into the chat function. Keith's got number 3 and number 4 along with salary alignment and expectations and discussion. So yes, that can often create a bit of misalignment too. For those of you who don't know me, if this is the first webinar, Hanover webinar that you've joined, I'm Elle Robinson. I'm CEO of Leadership Solutions at Hanover. I'm a chartered occupational psychologist by background and spent the last 20 years, if not more, with leaders and teams working across sectors, industries, geographies, really supporting them to lead more effectively through things like assessment and leadership development and also coaching. We will have a bit of time at the end for Q&A, but do please pop your comments, as I said, questions, thoughts into the chat function as we go. I would love to hear from you. So just another question for you. You don't need to put anything into the chat function for this, but just take a look at this picture, this rowing team. And I'd like you to think, does this rowing team, do they look aligned? Are they pulling in the same direction? Are they all doing the same thing? Is anything off about what's going on with this picture? And I think if you take a look, there's a lot of similarity across all of it, but there is one rower who is just a little bit off. His oar isn't quite aligned with everyone else's. And when rowing, and it's the reason why I use this particular analogy, is that even a small difference in timing can reduce the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the crew. So the boat can still be moving in the right direction, and at first glance, everything appears really coordinated. But over time, those small differences can create drag, can reduce momentum, and ultimately impact performance. And what we often see in leadership teams is something that's very similar. On the surface, there appears to be harmony, positive relationships, meetings are really polite, respectful, there's apparent agreement, people think there's shared direction. But when you do look a little closer, when you get under the hood, you often find that there are, as we've already noted with that very first question, there's often different assumptions, different priorities, unclear expectations. There are varying levels of commitment from different members, and also different interpretations of what success looks like. And it's interesting because nobody's openly disagreeing, but nobody is fully aligned either. And it's not that the team's not moving in completely different directions. They are kind of heading generally in the right direction. And kind of in fact, like the rowing crew that you can see here, everyone might believe that they're working towards that same goal, but some might be doing it from very slightly different realities or different angles. And that's where things start to drift. And that's the important piece, that drift piece, because teams don't become misaligned because they disagree. They become misaligned because they stop testing whether they actually agree, which is an interesting piece of the puzzle when it comes to misalignment. So when we think about the drift piece, one of the reasons that misalignment can be really difficult to spot is that you rarely wake up in the morning as a team and go, okay, we are very disconnected, we are dysfunctional. It's not something that just suddenly shines a light in front of you. And in my experience, it's not how it usually happens, but more often it is that steady drift that starts to pull you off course. And it can often be quite subtle at first. It can result in decisions taking a little longer than they should. People can leave meetings with slightly different interpretations of what was agreed. Priorities can begin to get interpreted differently. One of the things that I see quite a lot is conversations resurface again and again because there was never really true agreement or understanding in the first place. Accountability can become quite blurred because people are working from a different set of assumptions, different set of expectations about who owns what. And then when you've got that, the tension starts to sit beneath the surface. It starts to bubble away. And not because people are openly disagreeing, but because they're not discussing the differences that exist. And over time, what then happens is that people and teams start to move at different speeds. And that's where the drift starts to happen. So some people might be pushing ahead and moving very quickly. Others might be stepping back and waiting for a bit more clarity. Others might think that everyone's aligned and they don't know that there's a gap at all. And I think the challenge that we find with misalignment and why it's so subtle is that none of these things in isolation feel really dramatic. And they're often dismissed as quite normal organizational and team issues. And people often think, oh, well, they'll sort themselves out eventually. But collectively, as these things start to add up and the gaps in the team get bigger, the misalignment also gets bigger. And that's why I often say that when misalignment occurs, it's not arriving as a conflict. More often it appears as friction. And the longer that friction goes unaddressed, the bigger it can get. And the bigger it gets, the more it starts to affect decision-making and execution and ultimately the performance of the team. But if misalignment is often hidden, and if teams don't suddenly fall apart, but they gradually drift, the burning question is, why does it happen? And one of the biggest reasons in my experience and the work that I've done with teams is that psychological safety is often misunderstood. And when I ask leadership teams whether they have psychological safety, most will say yes. People will get on well. As I said before, meetings are respectful. There's little overt conflict. There's lots of support around the table. You get and that's really important because that relational aspect for the team is great for rapport, for dynamics. People need to be able to get along and feel comfortable with each other. But comfortableness is not necessarily psychological safety. And many teams confuse that comfort with psychological safety. And what we get when we're looking at comfort, and what we see here on the left-hand side of the screen, is that politeness, avoiding tension, really trying to maintain that harmony and protect relationships around the table. You don't want to cause conflict. You don't want to upset people. You want to really keep the peace. But the problem is that when teams are really focused on kind of maintaining that comfort, they often stop testing assumptions. So real psychological safety, it looks quite different to just being comfortable. In fact, if you've got real psychological safety in the team, it allows you to feel uncomfortable. It's about people feeling that they're able to say what they really think, particularly if it's difficult, unpopular, and potentially challenging. So when you're thinking about your team and asking yourself, do we have psychological safety? It's really important just to think about some questions. So can we, in our team, challenge ideas? Can we admit that we don't understand something and something's not really clear? That's often one that gets people. Can we question assumptions? Can we raise concerns without worrying about how we'll be perceived? Because psychological safety is all about this and not fearing judgment and consequences. And it's interesting because Patrick Lencioni, some of you may have heard of him, talks about fear of conflict as one of the key dysfunctions of teams. And I think what he's really getting at is this idea that many teams become so focused on preserving harmony that they can stop having the conversations that they need to truly create alignment. And so some of the most aligned teams that I've worked with didn't always have the most comfortable meetings. I've observed quite a lot of meetings, and there's been quite a bit of tension, quite a bit of debate, quite a bit of challenge. It's been uncomfortable just to observe and not actually even be in the meeting myself. But it's always coming from a place of respect. It's always focused on the issue at hand, and it's always in service of making better decisions and doing the best for the organization. And I think the irony is that teams often avoid challenge because they want to maintain alignment, when in reality it's the challenge that helps create that alignment, because that's when you're able to really work through the disagreement properly. And it's what I've seen in practice when I work with leadership teams. And what I wanted to give you, if you bear with me, just some really quick examples of how misalignment can actively show up in teams. Some of it might resonate with you, you never know. So the first example that I wanted to share with you was really about a really highly relational team. So we generally really liked each other, really respected each other. Meetings were really positive, very little conflict. So on the surface, everything looked fine, everything looked really healthy. But because the challenge was limited, the discussions often went round and round in circles. So decisions took longer than they should. If they reached a decision, naturally progress was then slower, particularly slower than what the team wanted and what they realized was actually happening. The second example is from a leader perspective. So talking to a leader, they genuinely believe that they created that psychologically safe environment, but then doing a bit more of a deeper dive, speaking to all the different team members, a different picture emerged. So what had happened, because of the way that they'd created the environment and the climate around them, is that people had gradually stopped challenging. Concerns had been left unspoken, ideas weren't put forward, and people had just simply got on with their own priorities rather than raising issues openly. And that's why the leader thought everything was fine and all hunky-dory. The third one to share with you is where the leader had a really clear vision. He knew exactly where he wanted to get to. He could see it very clearly in his own mind, but he didn't communicate it clearly enough for everyone else. And because of that, And because of the climate he'd created, nobody really wanted to admit that they weren't entirely sure of where they were heading or what success looked like. So people just created their own interpretations of what the vision was. And because of that, they all began to start to pull in slightly different directions. But what's really interesting with all three of these teams that I worked with is that none of them described themselves as dysfunctional. They were all very capable teams. They were all delivering. They were all busy. But without the clarity, the challenge, and the psychological safety, they just weren't fully aligned. So they weren't as effective as they could be. And that's one of the reasons why misalignment can often catch teams by surprise. So like the rowing crew in the earlier picture, everyone may be working hard, everyone may be moving forward, but if people are operating from different assumptions, if they're focusing on different priorities, they've got different interpretations of things, the team can gradually drift off course without really realizing it. So one of the biggest risks, one of the biggest alignment risks, is often the conversation that the team isn't having. And I think that's really important and quite a good insight just to remember. But we have looked at what causes misalignment, and we have looked at how it can show up in practice, so how it might manifest in the team. I'm just thinking about that. But you're probably asking, if that all happened, what do aligned teams do differently? What can we do differently to really unsurface and get to understand if there is misalignment happening within our teams? So the first thing that really aligned teams do differently, and there are 5 different things that I'll walk through here. They're quite simple, and they might resonate with you as well. But the first thing that aligned teams do is that they test assumptions. They don't assume that everyone has heard the same thing. They don't assume that everyone's interpreted it in exactly the same way or left the meeting with the same understanding. They actively check that everybody has heard, everybody understands and is on the same page when they leave the room. Because it is quite easy for you to communicate a message and assume that everybody is hearing exactly the same thing, but we all come from it from a different perspective. We all have different experiences. We all have different realities. And so how we perceive and how we receive some of those messages could be slightly different. The second thing aligned teams do is that they do create that space for challenge. So they recognize that constructive disagreement is often where alignment is built. So rather than avoiding that tension, avoiding that challenge, they create an environment that welcomes different perspectives, that allows them to explore those different views before they make decisions, which then, in effect, allows them to make more robust decisions because they've seen it from all sorts of different angles. The third thing teams do differently is that they clarify priorities. So one of the biggest causes of misalignment is not being explicit about what matters most. And aligned teams are able to create that clarity around the priorities and around what success actually looks like and create that shared understanding. The fourth is making decisions really explicit. So they're really good at making sure that roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities are clear when it comes to who's making decisions, when a decision's going to be made, and what are the next steps, and who will own all of that. So they make sure that's really clear across the board. And then the fifth piece of the puzzle is that they do revisit alignment quite regularly, because it's not something that you achieve once, tick a box, and then move on. Because priorities change, circumstances change, assumptions can creep back in. And so the best teams, the most aligned teams, are constantly and continually revisiting whether or not they're still aligned. So they're using one of these 5 steps or all of them to test that alignment. And what I particularly like about these 5 different steps and these 5 different practices is that these are questions that don't require a new process, that don't require a new framework or a really big intervention. You can use these questions as simply as an aid to better leadership conversations. You don't have to do all 5. It's not a linear process. You can pull one out and focus on that. So for instance, you could, if the conflicting priorities in the team is something that's you think is misaligning the team, then focusing on how you clarify those priorities is something that you could really sink your teeth into. Often it's that single well-timed question that can uncover that misalignment that might otherwise have been missed or go missed for quite some time. So I think the overarching message really in terms of what aligned teams do differently, what they do exceptionally well is create that shared understanding. But there is one more factor to consider that can impact the effectiveness of teams and their alignment. And this links back to my webinar in May. And this is all about pressure, because alignment becomes even harder to maintain when pressure increases. So what do I mean by that? So pressure itself has a habit of exposing issues that already exist within teams. And if you joined my session in May, which was all about leading under pressure, you'll have heard me talk about how pressure is something that is now a constant. It used to come in waves, but now it's the water that we swim in daily. It comes at us from all different sides. And under normal conditions, teams can often compensate for small gaps in alignment, so people can work around misunderstandings, assumptions can often stay hidden, different priorities can remain manageable, and individuals can fill the blanks in for each other and somehow kind of keep those things moving forward. But when you add pressure into the mix, and as the pressure dials up, whether it's through change, growth, transformation, uncertainty, tight deadlines, or just trying to do more with less, and we've all heard that phrase for quite some time, those gaps become much harder to hide. And so what then happens is you can have small misunderstandings, which can become quite big frustrations. You can have assumptions that were never really tested suddenly become really visible in the room. Those different conflicting priorities, they compete with one another. Those different agendas can create tension. Execution can slow down because people are pulling in different directions, even if only slightly. And ultimately, when you put all of that together, performance will begin to suffer. So pressure itself really exposes alignment problems that already exist within the team. It really amplifies it. But this is why alignment isn't a nice to have, because it impacts performance and the effectiveness of a team. You need to pay more attention to alignment when under pressure so that performance isn't derailed. So if you think about those 5 steps on the previous slide, testing assumptions, creating space for challenge, clarifying priorities, making decisions explicit, and revisiting alignment regularly, all of these different ways can really be helpful in focusing on alignment when the pressure increases, can really help you kind of keep an understanding of how clear everything is, whether we have that shared understanding, and are we moving forward aligned as a team. So before I move into just some final takeaways, I thought I'd just share a few reflections for you to think about after today's session that might be helpful when you're exploring alignment in your team. So some of the things that were mentioned on that very first slide, the questions around kind of the difference in perspectives, the conflicting priorities, the slowing down of decisions. I think we've looked at kind of how misalignment is often kind of coming hidden beneath the surface and then coming through in these different ways, how it may not always be that obvious. So it's really important to be thinking from your own team's perspective about some of these questions here. And it may just be one question that really works for you, or it may be, let's go through all 4 of them, but it's useful to consider where alignment might currently be assumed rather than tested, where greater challenge could actually create greater clarity for the team. Are there conversations that are being avoided because they're uncomfortable, they're difficult, or they simply haven't felt urgent enough to have yet? And if you're thinking about those 5 different alignment steps, those 5 different practices from that slide, which one of those, if you were just to choose one, would have the biggest impact if you focused on it over the next few weeks? Those are just something for you to think about there. So then, just as a final takeaway, if there's one thing that I'd leave you with today, it's that alignment isn't about agreement. It's not about avoiding conflict. It's not about avoiding difficult conversations or maintaining harmony at all costs. What creates alignment and makes teams really effective is that they create enough clarity, trust, and shared understanding to work through differences and challenges in a constructive way. They test assumptions, they invite challenge, they invite different perspectives, and they revisit alignment regularly. That was more than one thing, sorry. Because alignment is something that you need to maintain. It needs to be something you revisit, and it's done through very deliberate conversations and asking those very deliberate questions. And often the most important conversation is probably the one that hasn't happened yet. So I'll leave you with a question about what conversation do you need to have with your team that will help you the most. So thank you for listening. We have a couple of minutes left for questions, if there are any. I'll just see if I can get my chat box back up. While I'm doing that, you can multitask. When working with teams, I'll just wait to see if there's any questions. I've got my chat box up. When working with teams, sometimes I'm asked the question around kind of, can you have too much psychological safety? Someone asked me that the other day, and you can completely disagree with me, but I don't think you can have too much psychological safety. I think it's much more about misunderstanding what psychological safety is. And as I've already mentioned, it's not about being nice and maintaining harmony. It's creating that environment where people can feel safe to challenge, disagree, and raise concerns. In fact, the most psychologically safe teams I've worked with often have the most robust debates because they know that they can challenge without it damaging relationships or credibility or anything like that. So there is a question. So I'd love to know or understand at least 3 powerful questions to ask the team on this. There are some powerful questions that are in the 5 different steps, and I can share those with you as well separately. But I think some of the powerful questions, really, I'm just having a look at my notes. I think it is really, well, actually, I think one of them, there's a couple of things, but there's one question that I always, when I work with leadership teams, if they want something to really test alignment quite quickly, so at the end of your next team meeting, you could ask everyone, what are each of you taking away from the discussion? And if you get it back from every person, it gives you a really clear and quick understanding of whether or not everyone's heard the same sort of thing. And there is another way you can phrase that as well, which is around kind of if you have that team meeting and then you say to everyone, well, how are you going to explain this decision to your team, for instance? How are you going to report it back? That can really help you understand how clearly your message has got across, but also how people have received it and heard it. And I think that can be quite powerful things to do with your teams. There's a question on psychological safety. I feel that there's also cultural differences. Operating in an Asian culture and tends to be hierarchical, top-down instructions. Generally, teammates are not encouraged to speak up. And how do we overcome this? That is a really good question. So I think it also depends on, and it might be something that I'll need to pick up with you offline, Rachel, because I think there's a bigger question around kind of understanding the context in which you're operating in, not just the Asian culture as well. Because I'm part Asian, I'm half Malaysian, and I understand the hierarchical top-down instructions, but I grew up partly in Asia and partly in Europe. So I've got a weird perspective on that. So I think it might be a long answer, but I can pick it up with you, Rachel. Oh, great. Wonderful. You're from Malaysia as well. Maybe we can pick that up offline and talk about that. And then if anyone else is interested to know more, we can share that too. I'm conscious it is now 1:30. I said it's a half-hour session. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. We will be putting this onto our YouTube channel. You'll get sent the link so you can watch it again. in terms of our next webinar, July 23rd at 1 o'clock, again, all focusing on the cost of avoiding conflict. And you will see how, if you're coming along to the different ones, how we're really looking at kind of effective team effectiveness, leadership effectiveness all the way through. There's a common thread. But Oana is also from Malaysia. Hi, it is a small world. But lovely to see everyone. Thank you for joining me. And I will be in touch with everyone just to say thank you directly as well. So have a lovely rest of the day.